Elon Musk claims to be pro-Ukrainian, touting his Starlink system's support for the Ukrainian armed forces. But when the Ukrainians needed it most, did he rug pull them, resulting in a failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive? Plus, we're going to talk about one of Russia's largest defense contractors going under. Is the one bright spot in Russia's war economy also starting to collapse? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's get into it. Okay, so this is one of the craziest stories because Elon Musk reportedly ordered the shutdown of Starlink satellite service as Ukraine launched its counteroffensive against Russia. This was in September of 2022 when Ukraine had really forced Russia onto the back foot, having liberated much of the Kharkiv region and was turning its attention to Kherson. And as Ukraine, despite it being eminently obvious that Ukraine was on conducting counteroffensive operations, Elon Musk ordered a senior engineer at the California offices of SpaceX to cut coverage in the areas, including Kherson, a strategic region in the north of the Black Sea that Ukraine was trying to reclaim. The Starlink engineer who leaked to this, a man named Michael Nichols, said that upon receiving the order, colleagues simply said, "We have no choice. We have to do this." And staffers complied, deactivating at least 100 Starlink terminals, going dark, reflecting a going dark on Starlink's internal maps. As a result, Ukrainian troops faced a huge communication blackout, according to a Ukrainian military official. Soldiers panicked. Drones that were watching Russian forces suddenly went dark, and long-range artillery units who were using Starlink-enabled systems to direct thew fire were unable to hit targets. One Ukrainian military officer said that troops failed to take a Russian position near Borislav on the eastern part of Kherson, and the encirclement stalled entirely, the official said. He described it as a failure. Now, what I want to point out is that, what am I talking about? Well, you might recall that in late September 2022, the Ukrainians were on the counteroffensive and had one of the most successful counteroffensives of the entire war. They broke Russian lines, rolling them out of the Kharkiv region and liberating hundreds of square kilometers of Russian-held territory in places like Kupiansk and Izium. Now, what's notable about this is that during this time, Ukrainian forces reported their Starlink terminals worked great. No one was deactivating Starlink terminals. And then the Ukrainians turned their focus to Kherson, which was seen as the next most vulnerable point for the Russian military. But you might recall that this counteroffensive effort went much slower. It was much more of a grind. And the Russians were actually able to successfully withdraw across the Dnieper River, preserving much of their badly needed combat power. And that combat power was able to dig in across the river and reinforce across the front lines, stalling out further Ukrainian counteroffensive efforts, right? And so this was a critical juncture. What he's talking about is, of course, these regions here in and around this region where the stalled Ukrainian advance, again, bought the Russians invaluable time to evacuate their forces, right? You can see here's Borislav. This is not a small region. This is not a meaningless region. You can see that this is a place where there had been a significant bridge where if the Ukrainians had been able to blow the bridge, they would have actually been able to cut the Russian forces off, surrounding them, trapping them in the region, and eliminating a huge portion of the Russian combat power at that time. Now, this is part of a pattern of behavior by Elon Musk. For example, he also reportedly nuked Starlink connections to Ukrainian naval drones who were targeting Russian positions in occupied Crimea, right? This was, of course, Elon claims it was a unilateral decision made at basically the same time in September 2022, where he suddenly stated that he decided that he didn't want Starlink to be used to target, to expand the war. Now, obviously, you might think, but Paul, didn't Russia expand the war by invading Crimea 10 years ago? And isn't this still part of the Ukrainian defensive fight? Yes, this is what makes this so strange, because the Ukrainians were very much fighting a defensive fight. And that was something that publicly Elon Musk said and acknowledged at the time. However, the issue is that around this time, you started to see Elon have an ideological pivot. He started to make more and more pro-Russian statements, alluding to Zelensky being a dictator, alluding to validating Russian claims of of Russian annexation of these regions. And it's been pretty, it was a pretty strange pivot from someone who, again, touts the fact that he is this super pro-Ukrainian guy. And what's even weirder is that, again, when asked about this, right, a SpaceX spokesperson contacted by email said that Reuters reporting is inaccurate, and then referred reporters to a post on X.com earlier this year that said Starlink is fully committed to providing service to Ukraine, which included it didn't specify what about the report was inaccurate, nor did it answer a lengthy list of questions about the incident, Starlink's continued role in the Ukraine war, or other details regarding its business. This is like saying, this is like United Health or a health insurance company who denies claims going, but listen, you may say that we're denying your claims or overcharging you or not providing essential care, but as you can see, you fools, we released a press release that said we are supportive of our customers' health. So sounds like you're pretty embarrassed to have not seen that obvious post. United Healthcare is committed to the well-being of its customers and their health. You fools. So obviously, the problem is, of course, that one of the things that we've seen is that Elon, in addition to having a bunch of these weird ideological shifts that have gone on over the last 2 years. In fact, here's what I want to do. I want to ask old Gemini here. I want to ask Gemini to list times Elon repeated Russian talking points about Ukraine. And let's just see what a quick AI summary. And this is what I actually love using this for, is letting it search the internet and compile other people's words back at them. Okay. So it talks about, right. It makes some interesting points here, including the fact that in October 2022, Musk posted a Twitter poll suggesting for his peace plan, which included, of course, Russian claims on Crimea getting formal recognition, saying that it had been historically Russian since 1883, which is, of course, exactly what Putin's justification for his initial annexation was. Again, ignoring the fact that Russia signed on to Ukrainian territorial integrity. So it doesn't just get to renege on the Budapest Memorandum, right? But somehow you say, but no, it's Russian since 1883. But Russia hasn't been Russian, right? The Russian Federation is not the same state as the Soviet Union and is not the same state as Imperial Russia. Of course, he says they should also just redo the referendums in the occupied regions under UN supervision, giving credence to the Kremlin stage referendums, which of course were done at gunpoint. And again, you can't have fair referenda under under occupation, right? And of course, he repeated Russian talking points about Ukrainian neutrality. This is, of course, one of Moscow's central themes, where he says Ukraine must remain neutral, but the neutrality is only really cuts one way. Ukraine is not being fought over in the sense of whose sphere of influence the Ukrainians want to be in, because the Ukrainians are like, we want NATO protection against Russian aggression, which in retrospect is completely valid because, well, Russia invaded them. And again, as we've talked about, giving Russia the veto power over any agreement Ukraine makes, because neutrality is a broad term, and Russia will simply claim that any agreement that doesn't benefit Russia is a violation of Ukrainian neutrality. So granting Putin a veto power over Ukraine is a classic Russian talking point. The fact that Elon suddenly, a month after rug pulling Ukraine in two crucial operations, suddenly begins to repeat Russian talking points is actually pretty wild. Right? And of course, Musk repeatedly expressed skepticism about Ukraine's ability to win the war, again, despite the fact that Russia has incurred substantially more casualties. he's even stated, quote, "There's no way in hell Vladimir Putin could lose the war," which is a fascinating point, given that Vladimir Putin, again, it's been 18 months since he said this, and Vladimir Putin isn't any closer to winning the war. And ironically enough, of course, it turns out multiple sources confirmed that, yes, Elon Musk was talking to Vladimir Putin directly, which is weird. We've also seen, basically, Vladimir Putin knows how to manipulate people, because whether you're Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump, or Elon Musk, all people who notably have no experience in diplomacy and foreign affairs, all, when they make contact with Vladimir Putin, they simply take the things he says at absolute face value, which is kind of insane. That you would think in business, you learn, hey, people aren't always fully transparent. But somehow they're like, but Vladimir Putin, definitely a transparent, straightforward guy. Truly America's most brilliant minds at work right there. Now, before we talk about the Russian economy and their questionable defense contractors, I wanted to mention, of course, guys, if you want to support the channel, you want Combat Vet News, right? This is this is the best way to support the channel, right? Members get access to a huge archive of uncensored combat videos, and of course support me and the team directly. This is the best way to do it by far. Nobody takes a cut. You're not funding, Google's share price, or you're not paying 8 to 10% to Patreon. And it enables me to do this every day and to continue to speak truth to power, right? I'm critical of just about everybody, the Ukrainians, the Russians, and certainly the administration, both administrations. So if you guys can become a member, the link is in the description. We'd appreciate it. One of the largest Russian defense contractors has actually now started to show signs of collapse, which is absolutely preposterous. This is KAMAZ. This is the largest Russian truck manufacturer in the country, is now cutting its working week due to what they say is a market collapse. This is Russia's largest truck manufacturer. Starting August 1st, is going to drop to working just 4 days a week, right? That's literally a 20% drop in their work schedule. And bear in mind, guys, KAMAZ, what I think is so significant, makes Russian civilian trucks, it's true. But as you can see, they make a huge variety of military vehicles, including the chassis for carrying some of Russia's most advanced air defense systems, like the Pantsir 1. You can see here's a KAMAZ Typhoon. But we've literally seen a lot of these vehicles operating. They also, of course, operate civilian vehicles as well, tractor trucks, fire trucks, emergency vehicles. So these are vehicles where there should be both civilian and military demand. So the fact that even though the Russian civilian economy has been in a bad way for a long time, we're now seeing the Russian military economy start to collapse. KAMAZ said they had a 60% year-over-year drop in demand for their commercial trucks with payloads over 14 tons. This means that, of course, the company's net profit plummeted by literally dropping basically to 1/28 of their previous profit levels. In a statement on Telegram, the company said the downturn was actually because of foreigners, those damn foreigners who are, quote, flooding the Russian market with excess inventory. Now, you might recall that sanctions mean that foreign suppliers, basically only China, is really selling things to Russia directly at this point. And it's more likely, again, blaming foreigners is easier and more politically convenient than blaming the collapsing Russian economy, because, again, the owners of these Russian businesses, these oligarchs, Putin depends on them for their support, but they also need to maintain Putin's favor to avoid getting pushed out a window or having their assets seized, as has happened to Russian senior executives and billionaires over the last month or so. And so blaming foreigners is easy. Blaming a collapse of Russian internal demand, much harder. In fact, they said over 30,000 imported trucks are sitting unused in warehouses, meaning that they are getting dumped onto the Russian market simply to get some kind of, to at least mitigate the losses. So you can imagine, though, that even with the sanctions, the fact that these imported trucks are unable to be sold at reasonable prices is a sign that inflation is thoroughly out of control, right? Because as we talked about, the strong Russian ruble means that it's hard for importers to import goods, right? But these trucks, despite that, these trucks are still not able to be sold. And Kamaz should be making a killing. They should be able to produce the trucks much cheaper domestically. But that's not true either, which means that it's actually, this is a problem, a crisis of Russian consumption. And that, I think, is the really the core problem here, right? They said the lack of market growth prospects and the pressure of importers' machinery residuals force us to show responsibility and take unpopular but necessary measures to reduce production. So they're saying blaming foreigners. They called the short work week a response to systemic distress, which is a pretty rough characterization. And again, the lack of market growth prospects is even Kamaz sort of admitting here, saying, yeah, it's a little bit of importers, but really this is the fact that the market is collapsing. And as we've talked about, the Russian central bank cutting the interest rate, because even Kamaz acknowledges that the high borrowing cost is also damaging their economy. Because as their competitor pointed out, the Tovaz said that, listen, normally we would just simply borrow some funds to sort of smooth everything over, to keep making these trucks, keep selling them, and at least enable us to continue operations. But when you're talking about a central bank interest rate of 20 to 21%, which means these guys are probably paying 23 to 25% on their loans, there's simply no ability. And remember, most businesses, most of Kamaz's customers are not going to buy these trucks cash. They are going to take loans, right? Just like you and I would lease a truck, a business leases or is going to get a loan for their truck. But if that loan is at 25%, you need to make sure you have enough business for that truck to justify an insane markup. And the fact is that Kamaz is like, listen, no one can justify this. No other business can justify taking out loans at this rate. So again, you have, unfortunately, or fortunately perhaps, both extremely high inflation that is not really being beaten back and a collapsing economy. But this lowering interest rate probably isn't going to help anything, because again, inflation isn't beaten. So if you lower interest rates, you're going to have runaway inflation. It's going to look even worse. And so this is not a good sign for the Russian economy. And they're hoping, again, as we talked about, that China, the world's second largest economy, is going to be able to offset some of these Russian losses. But the truth is, it's not. Russia simply has less gas to sell to China because they were hoping that they could offset some of these lost European flows. And this is, again, this is actually new, right? Because you might recall that the sanctions for Russia only applied to maritime oil put on tankers. Overland oil that went to Europe was actually never sanctioned until recently. And so the Ukrainians actually cut off one of the pipelines into Europe, simply refusing to extend a transit agreement. And so now, the Europeans also, don't feel bad for them. They have had 3 years to find a way to offset Russian oil, whether that's investing in solar, nuclear, finding other sources to import. There's many options. And so the fact that Gazprom is hoping to be able to sell to China, but that doesn't appear to be the case, because the Chinese economy is not in great shape either. And frankly, China's buying of raw materials is actually one of the ways that it maintains favor among a whole bunch of these developing nations. So it can't afford to not buy, say, to not buy, say, Indonesian oil or Cambodian oil or something, wherever there's oil producers, it can't afford not to buy their raw materials because it needs their favor. And buying those materials lines the pocket of the elites in these other countries. This is one of the core ways all countries maintain favor, but autocracies like China are especially kind of brazen with it. And so China couldn't buy more Russian oil if they wanted. The only way they can really buy more oil is if Russian oil gets relatively cheaper, i.e. the ruble has to fall in value, which it's not. It's actually rising in value. And two, if the Chinese economy grows so much that it needs all the oil it can get, if it just starts chomping on fossil fuels. But that's not true either, right? China invested in all these infrastructure projects that have gone nowhere. So the Chinese economy is more about trying to stabilize existing demand than to generate new growth. Anyway, guys, thank you so much to all our Colonel tier members, folks like Tom Anderson, Dan Cochran, Jalen Gale, Officer Murley, Deborah Oppenheimer, Paul JW, Jeff Javies, Mac54, Stream Market, DreamHack Club, all of our Lieutenant tier members. I could not do it without you guys. I hope you enjoyed Thursday's video, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Cheers.